that, and I should start. It's very loud. But with that, it's just my pleasure to welcome Professor Asiimwe to present on his new book. And yeah, we look forward to hearing the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar and the History Department, for arranging and honoring me with an opportunity to have a conversation with you about this book, Mismanagement of Sub-Nationalism and Diversity in Nations, the case of Buganda in Uganda, 1897 to 1990, by Makerere University Press. I thank colleagues, I thank eminent scholars who have spared time to come and have a discussion with me on this book. Maybe let me start with what provoked me to write this book before I go into the substantial presentation. Certainly, I'd always been intrigued by the sub-nationalisms across Africa that came up after independence, Biafra, and all those. And in Uganda, we had Bugisu, we had Buganda, and sometimes some people say recently the Bakonjo question. And how it was managed or mismanaged, I thought that it was not really very, very healthy for sustainable nation building. But anyway, what sparked my desire was when I was doing my PhD, and it was on coffee marketing. And I realized that in 1960s, early 60s, the coffee prices, farm gate prices, government administered prices were very high until 1966, when they drastically decreased vis-a-vis the cotton prices. Yet international coffee prices were high compared to low cotton prices. That was an enigma to me. I anyway didn't take it seriously, and I picked that data from a paper I got from Owino to wrap some granules to go with. That shows how we don't value data. So my professor insisted, he said, no, Godfrey, you can't simply put this aside. What happened? What can explain the abruptly declining coffee prices when internationally they were increasing compared to the cotton prices? And the PhD is a reflection journey. I put that aside after a month as I was bathing and reflected. Fortunately, as a historian, I remembered the 1966 crisis, and that over 90% of the coffee in Uganda was produced in Buganda. Then I realized Obote was really strangulating the economic power of Buganda. And I said, I must trace this further. So that was my interest. And then I started with some reflections. Should new nations like Uganda manage, and that word manage is not a good word. It's multiple, diverse, pre-existing nations through crushing. Now we talk of crushing, we will crush them. Subjugation, opportunism, subterfuge, strangulation, or should it be through skillful accommodation? Is the enduring Buganda nationhood its indirect, mutated, or aggressive agency and mutations its indirect muted or aggressive agency and mutations from the Wataka resistance through to KY and post-independence agency are necessarily given the artificiality of the new nations? Is it warranted? Such subnationalism, as we saw in Biafra, Bugisu, Bukonjo, South Sudan, Katanga, actually point to a problem of artificial states versus the right self-determination and preservation. And riding roughshod even evokes small nationalisms, for example, in Kayunga, the Banyala, the Baluri, and Bakochi. So, how did the Buganda question, which is a representative of all this subnationalism, unravel in Uganda? And how was it either managed or mismanaged? And what are the lessons for the future? This enduring Buganda question is sensitive. It opens wounds, evokes emotions, generates evasion from the rest of Uganda, which is unfortunate. Consequently, many works and players tend to be subjective and defensive, immersed in blame games. So what I did was to glean through these works, especially of the main players, in order to historically reconstruct the nitty-gritty pieces for a balanced understanding of the trails. Now let's continue the justification and my approach. I construct a typology in order to interrogate the character, predispositions, and operations of the differently positioned players in the Buganda crisis. And I have phases. 3 phases are distinct. The first phase, this was the early colonial conquest phase. I interrogate the new breed of Bakungu versus Buganda versus the Bataka and the Kabakaship institution. I look at marginalized Buganda, the Bakopi, and the Catholic in this architecture. I also, during this phase, I underline how indirect rule and direct rule and divide and rule, reinforced by Bakungu agents in other parts of Uganda, shaped Buganda and the rest of Uganda relations. Relations were constructed, these Uganda-Buganda relations were constructed on perceptions of Buganda's insular parochialism, perceived big brother aggrandizement over backward neighbors, repressive Buganda colonial agents, the Bakungu, hence the anti-Buganda disquiet that came handy for Obote. Yet Buganda, Bakungu agents were as repressive and exploitative to fellow Buganda, whom they had reduced to Basenze. Now, the second phase was towards independence. This was led by Andrew Cohen, his transition from indirect rule to unitarism, the new order, progressive Buganda versus Mutesa, neo-traditionalists, and Buganda preservation. This was in the second phase. And the third phase, I investigate factors and actors in the complex matrix of the unfolding crisis. And this was the post-independence. And in here, we have players like the neo-traditionalists and their constant changing positions, and the progressive Buganda, or versus the progressive Buganda. And then we also have the principal actors, especially Obote, Mutesa, Ibinjira, and their predispositions and roles. We also look in this phase the internal and foreign groups' interests and machinations. Those were also at play. The Cold War and Congo geopolitics fed into this crisis. You remember the Ocheng motion and all that. We also had the ethnic factor that really stood out so prominently. And of course, the saga of the lost counties in the unfolding crisis. Then we have the two theories. The one I think is what I use most, the inevitability of this third crisis, 1966 crisis, versus the conspiracy theory. I maintain that such complex dynamics demanded skillful statecraft finesse. And to me, the principal actors were adjudged deficient or even facilitating the imbroglio. All of them. For example, on the Buganda side, the Ndaiga saga, Mengo Ibinjira schemes, Luchiko order against the central government, and elements of sabotage. On the Obote's side, his post-crisis disproportional, vengeful political and economic strangulation of Buganda was uncalled for. And I have this in chapter 5. Now let's go into the first phase, which I put at around 1897. Uganda, like most African countries, is a new nation. I think it's about 60 years, I'm as old as it, which was arbitrarily crafted from diverse pre-existing nations for the political expediency of colonialism. What was here were not tribes, but they were nations in their own right. And those were the ones that were colonized, subjugated, and destroyed through conquest or deceitful suzerain so-called agreements. So viable polities like Buganda were fundamentally transformed, I think is an understatement. Invaders and their missionary groomed collaborators, the Bakungu, led by the opportunistic traitors like Apollo Kagwa, staged a coup against Buganda nationhood. Leading scholars on Buganda have Professor Kasoze. I would want us to interrogate whether really Mutesa meant to invite the British missionaries, or he was playing the Musheshe trick of bringing them in order to forestall threats from the north and east. but it's taken literally. But in actual fact, these were invaders. And you need to read the painful rebuttal by Mwanga and Bataka, well written in Professor Lunyigo's book, Mwanga II, or the malignment against the Buganda state. These Bakungu and their mentors ejected the Bataka and Sabataka, who was betrayed by his own opportunistic commander, Semeika Kungulu, and captured. He was frog-lipped and exiled. They irregularly enthroned Bebe Chua to claim legitimacy. They thumbprinted a fake agreement with invaders. They shared Baganda's taka and relegated Baganda to Basenze, who now had to pay Busulu and Imvujo for occupying private land. They superintended the overhaul of the corpus totality of Buganda, thus modernized, civilized the long-time constructed nationhood, culture, and identity. Yet Buganda's so-called backward credentials proved formidable in its defense, preservation, and subsequent agency. Kagwa even schemed to elevate himself to an aristocrat and could dare denigrate a devalued Kabaka Chua and repress, imprison the Bataka. And for his modernizing accomplishments, a street from Bwaise to Kampala is named Sir Apollo Kagwa. Buganda crisis phase 2, imposing a united Uganda. Colonialism hastily retreated after World War II and sought to fabricate a supra-nation. We needed to interrogate what a nation is and whether Uganda is a nation. That's why I put quotes. I thank Professor Kasozi, who actually particularly underlined this factor. So this supranation Uganda. When stampeded, this was in 1953. Cohen came and said, do this sign here. When Mutesa and Buganda raised concern about positionality into the new dispensation, Cohen had the audacity to exile a Kabaka. So for the second time, the Kabaka was, by the way, I don't think we should call him a Kabaka. He was already devalued. He could be tossed around. So the institution was no longer the traditional Buganda institution of the Kabaka. He could be summoned. And you need to read what Mutesa wrote. He had a pistol. He wanted to shoot Cohen. It's common sense that refrained him. So that was the second crisis. He came back. He was forced to sign some new agreement that he was supposed to be just a Yoya Byanswa, Kabaka, what, and all that. But he refused. But as the new order and independence were a fait accompli, neo-traditionalist gatekeepers drifted into turbulence and generated into helter-skelter preservation that spilled into the third crisis. Hey, it has frozen. Huh? Yeah. My time is.
I'll pause the time.
Okay. So that was the second crisis. And the Buganda tried to, Mengo tried to ask, and it was being hardened. And so we have the ingredients of the third crisis. So in the turbulence, recalcitrant neo-traditionalists became vulnerable, desperately vulnerable to sabotage and chicanery, leading to hasty, consummated marriage of convenience with, of all, the avowed Republican, opportunistic, unitary nation building Bwete and his schemers. Out of despair, they gave him a clan, a Fishcat clan, and the name Bwete. Thus gave him citizenship of Buganda as they denied it to Benedicto Chuanaka for daring mobilize with the new progressive Buganda, defying the Kabaka. Conversely, apart from one school that describes the both as opportunistic, as a liar in pursuit of his immediate interests, the other school looks at him as an astute nation builder who applied the right tools for the time to build and keep together a young nation at a critical time. So unlike the naive truth and justice Benedicto Chuanaka, which cost him his premiership, this perspective considers Obote, considers Obote's statecraft finesse as having managed to seduce, hoodwink, and later tame Buganda for the sake of Uganda's independence and unity as a nation, in quotes. Now, I highlight how the superficial alliance over deeply entrenched complexities or republicanism versus traditionalism and federalism was bound to collapse. And this brings me to the post-independence Buganda crisis, phase 3. So the first one, 1897, the second one, 1952, this one, 66, 67. Yet these deeply entrenched complexities were conveniently assuaged by subterfuge, with phony pretentiousness, hollow agreements, unworkable constitution, cosmetic compromise of federalism versus unitarism. The alliance was predicated on deceit, incompatible actors, driven by narrow interests on both sides, on Mutesa to wrest power from the hated DP and Chuanaka, as he writes, for Obote to wrest power and become the next leader. The blind neo-traditionalists, opportunistic UPC, Protestant establishment, and the colonial mentors assumed away or deliberately deceived on fundamentally unworkable structures for the sake of wresting power from DP. And again, Rangari Nyigo has a history of DP on this. So the unholy alliance had to inevitably crumble into a third Buganda crisis, or it generated conspiracies as Mengo and the Injira factions reinforced each other towards the crisis. Now, these interlacing and reinforcing ingredients were the complex legacies, notably the lost counties. The British simply evaded it, despite persistence and struggles in Mubende by the Banyoro. They pushed it to the next independence government. Now, this was a litmus paper for Obote's statecraft. And there was a nod in the council that there must be a referendum. But Mutesa counted on his friend, Bwete. Said, since we gave him 21 KYMPs, he thought he would remain friendly. We see Mutesa desperate as some of the neo-traditionalists became opportunistic. They were even hoodwinked by the Nechons if they wanted ministerial positions, and they were deserting. Mutesa, you could read that he was really very sad. But he held on, and he schemed. He intelligently claimed that he was not doing anything, but his writing gives him away. As he came close to the brigadier, that's how he, in a fancy way, referred to him. Brigadier Opolot, married to a Muganda. Yes, that relationship was enough to. And so you get Ibinjira. His ambition is denigration of Obote. And his lies. And his lies. Him and Benaisa disenfranchised the ex-servicemen Mutesa had taken to Ndaiga. And he was there pretending to Mutesa. So this period is full of, and how they divided you. He extracted on ethnic basis a faction from within UPC, the right-wing faction, the Bantu faction of the Chabazinga, the feudalists. An ethnic factor was emerging, and Obote also designed one, the Felix Onamas. And I mean, Mutesa gives away that he thought there was a coup. He denies having been involved, but advised the brigadier to go and bring Obote, or to go and talk to the cabinet about the crisis, but not to, cautioning him not to give away much. So you can see all that sophisticated craftiness, and that Obote ran away into the woods. The whole story is interesting. But then that the brigadier did not go, he sent only soldiers, but later the brigadier said he went. So those contradictions are revealing. So there is also the personality predispositions of Mutesa, Obote, and Ibinjira towards each other. I think Mutesa was 30 years and Obote 31. I don't remember the exact years, but these were youthful. And of course, Mutesa was a royal. In the book, I quote him, the perception he had of this Obote who was grazing goats and once speared. And of course, Ibinjira, the Oxford lawyer, thinking that Obote didn't have credentials. So all those perceptions come into play. But also Obote and Nechon, actually Nechon told Mutesa in the face that he wouldn't have voted him. From the Lango region that was decentralized, didn't have the concept of kings, and which had suffered the brutality of Buganda agents. Did those shape the perceptions? And one still, Prime Minister Katikiro Chintu, actually from the onset hated Obote, and because Obote had let it out that he wants to crush the Buganda. And indeed, even the next Prime Minister, Joash Manja Kanji, underlined that Obote hated federalism from the onset. So this predisposition, was it a factor? And I think it was. And Obote was very succinct with his common man charter, anti-feudalists, those who have ascribed the status and all that. So those were very major factors that cannot be ignored. Then the internal factionalism and opportunism, notably in Mengo and within UPC. Now, in conclusion, when you reflect, did this crisis kill Buganda agency? I show how Buganda agency persisted. Informally, I've met some street thinkers who say, the Buganda, if there is a coup, they will only run to loot. They are cowards. They are cowards. They had a standing army that actually, if you read Nyigo's book, they defeated the British. The British had to hastily try to mobilize the Nubians in here. Mwanga was, by the way, he was the first president of Uganda. He had weaved an alliance across Buganda. Instigated a mutiny. They had to rush for the Indians to bring them. Again, he teamed up with Kabarega and they dealt the blow. The first guerrilla, they were the first to go to the bush, by the way. I hear some people thinking that they are the first. And had it not been the treachery of Kakunguru, who was his army commander, whom he had even given his sister to marry, who went and he thought that his commander was coming to update him, and he betrayed him. So is that a weak army? They rowed canoes in this lake to Kisumu at night without a modern compass. They got Mwanga from there, came and landed in Masaka. No canoe capsized. Is that a weak army? So, Buganda agency persists. Presently, it is seen in the demand for federal. Dissatisfaction with the Byoya Byanswa regional tier and whispered speculations about the resuscitation of the Buganda question through NUP. So if nationhood questions persist, the enduring lesson is that astute political engineering is required rather than crashing, Mumbele crashing, or subterfuge, deceit. We need this for a sustainable nation building project. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I think we should just move directly to the comments by the discussants. If I could ask Professor Wamala to begin, the floor is now open. Thank you.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to start by thanking the organizer for inviting me to be part of this seminar. Coming from a very different discipline, I feel very honored to be here talking to professional historians with all these very many, almost drowning facts. I really wonder how you manage to weave all these very many facts and be able to come out with the wonderful theories. So thank you very much for the invitation. Next, I want to thank or to congratulate Professor Asiimwe for this very wonderful piece of work. When he gave me his own copy soon after coming out of the publishing house, I went through and I found it a very excellent written piece of work. And so I said, no, look, let me get my own copy and let me look again. So thank you very much and congratulations for this well done piece of work. I am not a historian. I come from a very different discipline. Still, looking through and gathering a few facts here, there is something that I want to bring to the discussion. See, clearly, I'm not going to go through all those very many facts. I am picking on a few issues in this work, which I think quite interest me and which have been at the back of my mind for a bit of time. I am particularly talking about chapter 5 of this work, the stifling aftermath, and I want to relate that to what I've read in the discretion of my kingdom. I find something very intriguing here. And when I first read the discretion of my kingdom by Kabaka of Buganda, he didn't put his name, but he said, Kabaka of Buganda, discretion of my kingdom. I find something very interesting, and I beg that you allow me to read what Kabaka of Uganda wrote in 1967, when much of these things, some of these things talked about here were taking place. The Kabaka of Uganda wrote, referring to independence, which was coming to many African states. This is what he wrote. The wind of change had started to blow in West Africa, and there was no doubt now that Uganda would become independent. For most Africans in such a position, the question is when. For us, meaning for the Baganda, the question is whither. We had struggled long and hard to retain our integrity during the life of the protectorate government. Now, the situation was to be different, and we looked ahead to see if there would be different dangers. Where would we stand in an independent Uganda? Buganda's relationship with Uganda had never been important before, meaning it had never been important to the Buganda. Maybe they simply didn't think about it. It had never been important for them. We had dealings with the British and we had friendly neighbors. From now on, we are constantly aware that we comprised 1/3 of the area and had rather less than a quarter of the people of Uganda. You'll allow me to read this long quotation because it will help me to get the point that I want to get across. And that the airport, the university, and the main cities were in our land. Our territorial position is a little misleading, as the large amount of it is the water of Lake Victoria. Nevertheless, we are far the largest and most forward unit in Uganda, if smaller than the combination of the rest. It was not true that if we are granted a federal status, everyone else must get it also. We never had at any time a wish to expand, nor did it make sense to suggest that I should become the Kabaka of all Uganda, though some of my wilder supporters suggested it, which naturally upset the people outside Buganda. We wished to do what we wanted to do, to continue to govern ourselves as we were demonstrably capable of doing. I want to stop there. Now, what point are we getting this? Point number one, which I find very intriguing, and which I read this book when I was still young, but I didn't understand it, is that in Buganda there was a fear. Whereas everybody else was excited, here we are people who are so fearful. Where are we going and how are we going to fit in? Now, having looked at that fear, I again came across a lot of literature talking about something which Professor Asiimwe has not helped me bring out very neatly, but I think is aware of it, the Buganda question. What is the Buganda question? Who is asking the question and what are the key elements of that question? I felt that these kind of concerns Mutesa was raising here, maybe we are part of that question. But then, when I read chapter 5 of Professor Asiimwe's book, I said, finally I start to understand. In fact, I want to thank Professor Asiimwe for helping me to understand some of these issues, because I thought there were rumors. I didn't quite understand. There were very serious issues till I read this piece of work. And I want to thank the reader for having helped me. But I think it would be very important if a larger audience, or a larger population read this book, because I don't know whether many people have really read this book or whether it has had a review in the media. Because if a review was there, I think we would understand better some of these issues. What are the key issues in this chapter 5? In chapter 5, Professor Asiimwe neatly catalogues the many different areas where there were systematic attempts to strangulate Uganda. What are some of the cases? For example, dealing with Uganda as an entity. In the first instance, we are told that in 1967, Obote subdivided Uganda into Masaka, Mubende, Bombo, and Impigi administrative divisions. Buganda thus, and that's the most important point that I want to note, Buganda thus ceased to appear on the map, both in name and as a political entity. I started to wonder, is this the fear that the Kabaka had when he wrote that? For many, the question is when, for us is whether. Were these the kind of fears Mutesa had? I was wondering. Asiimwe goes on to tell us about the anti-Buganda economic policies. Again, I'm hearing for the, I just knew about this here. I never known about it before, because of course I'm not a historian and I never read history at to any respectable levels. And what we see here, that there were deliberate state policies that could impact on people's development. Let me read what it says here. This chapter thus uses the political economy approach to show how deliberate state policies can impact on development and people's agency against the stifling state. How could the state, claiming to be the sovereign here, come out to stifle a group of people? I was wondering what was happening here. Asiimwe did not help me to understand what motivated this kind of behavior, where a state singles out a particular group to stifle them economically. Were they a threat to anybody? But then, of course, this goes to give credence to what Kabaka had written in the book, The Desecration of My Kingdom. Maybe people were simply envious. Maybe they were jealous of what had happened here. But were those jealousies really genuine? Were they founded, well-founded? Because when I look around, I see so many impoverished Buganda, just like I see everywhere else. So what was the basis of that kind of behavior? In many other areas, I see cases where, for example, cooperative unions were again disabled for the sake of weakening the Buganda elite. I find a contradiction somewhere in Asiimwe's presentation, and that contradiction comes on page 121. On page 121, Asiimwe says, Buganda was more affluent than most parts of Uganda, owing to the colonial divide and rule policy that deliberately developed it as the cradle of cash crop production, administration, and commerce. Although cotton production declined, Buganda remained the leading producer of Robusta coffee. This created regional imbalance. On average, Buganda's annual cash income at independence in 1962 was $53 per year, compared to $14 in the western and northern regions of Uganda. I may not conclude this, but I think you get that point there. My question here is, if Obote comes out, or if the state comes out with policies, which you call here stifling policies, maybe they were trying to balance the equation, to ensure that the rest of Uganda was at par. So are you being honest? Are you being fair? Not honest, but are you being fair to the architects of the modern state? If you say they came out to stifle, maybe having realized that this place had already an upper hand economically, they try to balance so that other areas which were not as fortunate or as endowed could also come up. You know, something with the sort. So I don't know whether Professor Asiimwe will clarify that kind of issue. There are many areas, there are many chapters in this, but I think I've made my point. The point that I want to underscore in this chapter is, were there deliberate policies aimed at Buganda to weaken it, or were there simply attempts to balance the boat? Secondly, and finally, have we seen an end to these kind of policies, or maybe they have mutated in various ways? I just want to throw that to the historians to help us understand better. Thank you, and congratulations on what I consider one of the best books I have read in recent years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll go through the three discussants, and then you can respond to as much of this as you feel able to at the moment. So, Dr. Merritt, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I want to add my voice to that of Professor Omala to say one. I'm not a historian, but I'm greatly humbled and honored to have been invited to be one of the participants, one of the discussants of such a phenomenal piece. Congratulations, Professor Asiimwe, putting together certain projects can always come with its own challenges, especially in the area of let me call it social sciences or social studies, history, political science, literature. In publication could have both wonderful and not so pleasant consequences for the author. But it's a wonderful piece you put together. I was privileged to read this book when it first came out, along with another book on the same subject by Amos and Tambich Komeko, titled Mutesa's Murder. This one is not a historian. It's not even an academic. It's not a scientist. He's actually an accountant who specializes in doing autobiographies. And I'm just so fascinated by how much these two works, these two pieces of literature, kind of drawing from different sources, present facts and arguments a similar way. I think I could as well use this to add credit to the piece that Professor Asiimwe put together. So I'm looking at this work along with that of which has an interestingly controversial title. The person chooses to use the word murder and not death. Anyway, I'll not go into that. So, Professor Asiimwe, just a couple of issues come to my mind when I engage with this work. You point out throughout this text the issue of Bataka versus Bakungu as a form of internal crisis, kind of Buganda against Buganda, Buganda against themselves in the process of nation building. So this power struggle, could it not be one of those gaps that actors like Obote and others could have taken advantage of, and then history might indeed be judging Obote and such other people unfairly, just because the Baganda, presented an issue on table that these others took advantage of, and they were actually playing the Baganda game. Secondly, I love some of the details you present about the Ndaiga battles. Lots of things, those of us that are not in the world of history, we haven't had the chance to access. But your book gives us a chance to access some of the happenings behind the Ndaiga stories and the battles. So, in one of Mutesa's testimonies or statements about the happenings in Ndaiga, he uses the word, this happened and they discovered I was in earnest, and you said you used a discourse analysis approach. That statement, together with several others that you cite in this text and you find in the other sources you used, could they not show something about Mutesa the person and his attitude that could perhaps have gotten the state and other actors to treat Buganda and Baganda the way they did, given his use of language, which demonstrates perhaps his attitude and worldview and perception? Just like you cite, he refers to one of the major actors in this game, Obote, as a descendant of goat rearers, and so inconsequential anyway. So what's your comment about this person's use of language, perhaps as a reflector of his personality, which could have triggered some of the issues Buganda and Baganda eventually suffered? Okay, just two last points. There's quite a bit of talk about Obote and the state for that matter, and their actions and plans and schemes against or about Buganda. Do you think, from your engagement with these sources as a discourse analyst and as a historian, Obote was right from the onset scheming for the presidency of Uganda? And perhaps the reason, as some schools of thought put it, he supported Mutesa to be president at the London conference. That was just a strategy to just move away from that stage, and then he would get his power later. And not that indeed he wished Mutesa to be president, but he was scheming. Or could it be that what Obote did, and what perhaps maybe you'll explain, perhaps you leave out deliberately because maybe it's catered for in other sources, other publications before this one. What happened before Mutesa and Obote came to the scene? By, say, actors like Semaika Kungulu and what he did in the Lango sub-region where Obote hails from, could it be Obote and his state, for that matter, did and planned all this that they did as a way of taking revenge that perhaps Mutesa and Buganda had even forgotten about? So finally, the agitation of Mengo and Buganda to have the Uganda government and its facilities moved away from the Buganda soil. From this work, first came up in 1961. It re-emerges in 1966. And I'm not sure there weren't voices of that kind just about 15 or so years ago during the Kayunga debacle. So it is the same statement. Do you envisage a demand by Buganda or Mengo or Baganda, whichever label you may want to use, coming up with this demand again, and that this is actually the kind of unanswered question that Mutesa in the Desecration of My Kingdom raises, as Professor Omala quotes him. Thank you so much. Otherwise, it's a wonderful piece, and those of us that come from outside of history just enjoy to engage with the debates. And I love the way you interrogate language and never taking statements for granted. Actually, you engage with the statements from these actors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those comments. And now I have to moderate myself as a discussant. So I'll try to be very, very brief with just a few comments. on what I think is a very important work that it's not easy to condense this issue into a book form. I mean, and yet it's very, just to say, as it reads very clearly throughout on something that oftentimes we read about, twists and turns in the story of Buganda's relationship with Uganda, and it's easy to become lost in the complexity of it. And this, I think, just as a general point about how readable this book is, it renders it into something that makes it very clear, I think, for readers who for whom that's not necessarily their specialty. But it also makes a number of points that are, I think, new and important here. And I had questions. I had three sort of broad questions to ask about. And just to echo, I think, a point Professor Wamala made, that I think chapter 5 for me is really an important chapter, partly because it brings in it brings us out of a purely political story into one that combines the economics of nation building with the politics of the Buganda question about coffee marketing and buying, which I think has not been shown, I think, as clearly as you lay it out in chapter 5. And so I've, maybe I can start then with a question from that chapter about a topic that you've also written about how the question of citizenship and Asians in early post-colonial Uganda. And as you frame it here, the move to the left and the Trade Licensing Act and those moves in the late 1960s, followed by a welcoming of big Asian capital back into UPC, is seen in a different light. It's not, it's about, you frame it almost that the Asian question becomes a smaller subset of, quote unquote, the Buganda question. And so I wonder, thinking about this in a longer term, the relationship between Buganda's both the Kabaka and those around in Mengo since the 1950s with the question of Asian citizenship becomes very charged. So there's in 1959 the boycott campaign. Asians are also shops are also boycotted in 1954. But I wonder if there's a way that what you've shown here is that there's a as you distinguish between different groups within Buganda, that there's, when we think about Asians as a category, that actually there's multiple groups at play here from the perspective of Buganda, that say small Asian traders are being brought into this question in order to, as a negotiating tool, but that big Asian capital remains, backed by British capital, remains stable. In other words, it's a question about is the way that the question of Buganda is being dealt with really, in some ways, is this, can we go back to, just putting, how would dependency theorists have argued about this? Is this really that the question of where British capital was coming from couldn't be reconciled? That instead it had to be a question of that the state was not powerful enough economically to resolve these questions. That's sort of like, going back to some politics and class formation and other books of that era sort of making this argument. How do you respond to that question? And then the second question is maybe related about what happens to the UPC left. I think it's, Kakonge's faction is the only faction that has a base of support relatively equally distributed across the whole country. And is based on, at least ostensibly, on ideological lines. These are, and maybe generational lines, being generally younger men and women who are influenced by, say, Nehru and Nkrumah and other ideas of socialism. Yet they seem to disappear, in that form anyway, quickly. There's not a resurgence of leftist activism, at least along those lines. Once that faction has been brought under control. And so I wonder just if you have thoughts on what happens to this idea of, a global left as an answer to the national question. Is this, we see that in the 80s, there are some people who, sort of incorporate those ideas, but Obote himself becomes, signs up with the IMF and World Bank and structural adjustment. What happens to the left? And then finally, there's a question of language, which just occurred to me in the presentation. Politics of language in your title, in your talk, throughout the book, and really in everything that's written about these questions. Nationalism, sub-nationalism, ethnicity, tribe, principality, chiefdom, the language to articulate what an entity, what, say, Buganda is at any given historical moment, changes. But I think what your narrative shows is that the changes in language don't always mirror the actual changes in political reality. And so I wonder if you could just reflect on your choice of language in the book, of nationalism, sub-nationalism, and so on, and how scholars deal with these sort of tricky labels. But thank you again for really an important book that I hope everyone will have a chance to read. So thank you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think if you'd like then respond to the comments, and then we'll open the floor after to the audience questions.
Prof, the mic is off.
Sorry. Yeah, I thank the discussants for the invaluable contributions that really help to throw more light and augment some of the salient argument. Professor Amala, you are extremely right. I mean, if you really read the description of my kingdom, it was prophetic, and you could really see the Kabaka losing the kingdom, and the future of the kingdom unpredictable. There was that sense. And as I said, I mean, it's not only Buganda, by the way. The others also were concerned about their position. And I thank Professor Kasozi. I mean, from 1950s, when the British lost, I mean, after the Second World War, they had those constraints, they had pressure from America. They were stampeding them. they were stampeding them into a unitary dispensation to Westminster politics, multi-party, which Buganda as a monarchy did not understand. And those issues came up in 1953, and independence was 10 years, about 9 years later. So they indeed had a right to ask. You don't know that the Vagisu were first. Actually, they were more assertive. I think they didn't want even to join Ugandan independence. But Buganda being prominent, it was amplified more. Now, of course, there is a theory that Obote was a nationalist. He was this nation building project out of diverse nation building project. And therefore he was balancing and redistributing, and there was that redistribution, and many credit him for that. But I think in the case of Buganda, it went far, and it really was openly deliberate. It was openly deliberate. First, for example, when prices of coffee were drastically cut, the prices of cotton were increased so much, yet at the international market, cotton prices were declining. So the redistribution notwithstanding, but I think there were a series of policies combined that really were so stifling, specifically to Buganda, and I don't think that was fair. The fairness is what I really question, because there were other areas that were growing other cash crops, like of course tobacco, and we didn't see that type of twisting. So in addition to that, of course, even the whole marketing of coffee, it followed that, and so I think although things may have been in good faith, I think that was a little too obvious in the case of Buganda. So I thank you very, very much. Yes. Yes.
How about the ministerial position? Because you refer to them also as also having been skewed in favor of some people and disenfranchising some others. Was that something of then, or maybe it is universal? I mean, we could maybe get it in other dispensation as well. What do you comment about these ministerial distributions of posts? I think you're quoting Kasozo on that one.
I don't think that
yes, but the quotation here, the reference you made.
Yeah, but my major question is that really Obote did most of that after the crisis, not before, and that makes him a suspect of vengefully strangulating Buganda. And for that, I mean, he had, of course, many progressive Buganda, that Benaisas and all that, and that explains why the Buganda were sort of unanimously antithetical to Benais or Muanga and all that. But I think Botha didn't do it in good faith. From 1960, from the crisis time, he was trying to target a people and a region. Yet his quarrel was with a few neo-traditionalists, not necessarily the Buganda generally, because many were also under the yoke of these landlords. To my friend Merit, thanks very much. The Bataka Bakungu issue. By the way, I'm very, very critical of this Bakungu. These were just appointed. Even the Kabaka used to appoint them. But the Bataka were the real fulcrum of Buganda. And these Bakungu, now, of course, the new Bakungu, the Christians, the Apollo Kagwaza and all that, we see that there was that power struggle. And by the way, the Bataka came back immediately. And when I say Apollo Kagwa denigrated Chwa, the Bataka and Chwa were trying to demand that the massacre, the land comes back. And you need to read how Kagwa denigrated the Kabaka. Unfortunately, the Kabaka was still young and he just ignored it. That's why I say that actually after 1897, we never had the Kabaka again. These were just could be manipulated. And of course, Obote was very happy to tap into that gap because of the infighting. But also, in addition, some of these opportunistic Bakungu who gave way, there are also some progressive Baganda whom they were fighting, who were national in character. So indeed, all those trajectories played into Obote's hands, and he was quick to exploit them. The Abu Mayanjas and all that, and he was quick to tap into that gap. The language of the Kawak is so, you're so fluent and smooth, and you could see it was really, but in many cases that also gave him away, showed his attitude and temperament and all that. And yeah, the Kabaka was young and he felt he was a Kabaka and he wanted to show it in earnest. And at times, as I point out, forgetting that he's a president of Uganda. So to him, Buganda came first. And so all of that, and his attitudes as a monarch, I mean, you could see how he was even laughing at Chuanaka for having admired the Duke. So, and some people actually say that I met another argument that he was not up to the task, that in the middle of all that, he would go up hunting and all that. But maybe underrated all that was happening. But you could see some frustrations. The first, of course, his mother remarrying a Mukopi. And he had a very strong group around him that he couldn't reign over. And so sometimes I really sympathized with him. But he tried, of course, his personality came out. Yes, of course, these agents, the Baganda agents outside, and these were we cannot condemn Buganda. We cannot continue to say Buganda, Buganda. There was a difference. We have to disaggregate. These were collaborators who were appointed out, but then what they did, unfortunately, was termed Baganda, Nyangira Baganda. The Bachagoroso, the Nyabinj cart against Baganda, and all that fed into this anti-Buganda squat, and that was a tool for Obot. I don't know whether Obot alone, but maybe even subsequently, that is always the the thing that the Baganda. So I think that was really unfortunate. Okay, will Uganda not again demand that these people leave the soil? Again, I must say that many Baganda are a progressive Baganda. By the way, all the national parties started in Buganda. Of course, I'd like to give tribute to the likes of Musazi. Musazi himself was the more victimized and vilified by Mengo. But there were so many, and these are nationalists in earnest. So I doubt whether really that would come about. So I don't know what the thoughts around are, but I really don't think so. Indeed, Dr. Edgar, you are very right. In my chapter 5, I later show that before the crisis, of course, the citizen question was very, very prominent. Obote pursued anti-non-citizen policies, even the one who expelled the Jaluo, but the Asians were top on his agenda. But we see that from 1966, he shifts, he changes, it becomes reconciliatory. And again, my professor insisted, why? And my thinking was that because the Baganda middle class were prominent, many had reinvested money from Busuru, from Mvujo, from coffee into business. They had formed organizations. They had started associations. They were potentially a formidable group. As formidable as the present Kwagalan. Now, this so we see Obote fearing that if these Asians leave a gap, a lacuna, certainly the Baganda would, who are even centrally positioned, would certainly feed it. So there is a tendency for leaders to prefer an alien commercial economic class that can be manipulated than the local ones who have a power base, because those will be a threat. So indeed, I point that out, that shift, and that's when actually, when there was a coup, the Baganda, and I write it there, in the associations of they immediately went to Amin and told him, and the excitement of Dada, I mean, that the Asians had come back and had taken those positions and strangulated their own associations of. Then what happened to the Kakonge, the far left group? We see Obote purging the Dandasalis because they were extreme right and pretending to be center left. But then, of course, later with the Common Man's Chat and move to the left, we really see that he takes that trajectory. But you are very, very right. I mean, this group sort of declined. I think that can be investigated more. Fortunately, some are still around, like the Chintu Musokes. We need to add. I think this is not the last. There is more research to do about these dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so we can now have questions from the audience. I see 2 hands, 3 hands, 4 hands. Why don't we plan to take 3 questions in a round, and then we can, after 3, then you'll be able to respond and then come back. Is that manageable? All right. So could I ask Professor Kasozi, and I'll have to ask for the online audience if when you ask the question to come and speak into a microphone. So yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll start like where others have started, that this is a very interesting book to our debate. We want to understand the causes of the failing state that Uganda is, because we are not sure of what is going to happen the next day. So the more we talk about it, I think the more we should understand what went wrong. Why is Uganda a failing state? Why don't we have the capacity to know and predict and create a system of changing our rulers without violence? We've never changed the president without violence. So what happened? These are questions really we need to ask. And what I've read, what I get from this book is that there are complex reasons for any incident, any crisis you mentioned, 1966, 1953, 1980. There are a number of problems that accumulate and then they burst. Whenever you put a lot of water in a bottle, it will burst. And I think that's one thing I learned from this book. But before I give my comments on this book, I wanted Edgar to say that the Buganda Asian issue is very well dealt by Jan Yelmet's book. There's almost a chapter, Jan Yelmet, Uganda, a political history. Have you read it? You've seen it? Yeah, he does it. He does explain very well how the Asians actually funded the UPC because of fear of the Buganda emerging middle class. And they cooperated with Obote, and if there was a quarrel between them, it was, I think, short-lived. Mind you, Madivani was the chief purchaser for Uganda government. He alone bought for Uganda government.
The big bourgeoisie, not the petty,
yes,
not the small bourgeoisie.
Not, of course, not the small bourgeoisie. So there was that collaboration. And I think Runyigo's book is also the one, Uganda, an Indian colony. How many of you have read it? It's very challenging. He also, Runyigo shows how it is. So that point is, eventually the Indians were gradually seen as part of the exploiters. And they are warned in parliament by Mayanja. And I hope I publish his biography, that unless they participated fully, they should not be surprised if something happens. So I think the Indian issue also needs to be revisited. But I think what I would like to say that this book is wonderful. It brings together a number of issues that we need to explain. Now, my problem with the book, this book is very clear, and I've told my friend Godfrey that your sources are limited to published sources, and that you should be consulting the archives. Now, Pamela has gone away. We have created a club, an organization, an advocacy body for us to make sure that the archives are well organized in Uganda. And we hope that every one of you will join, because a lot of what you write could be very well supported or contradicted by the archives. So that was my own problem, that there are many, many archival sources that you have not you've not dealt with. And of course, there are certain things that the picture of the person you call Michael Chinton on the photographs here is actually Badru Kakumbu, not Michael Chinton. This is the man here. This guy here, right? You see the man you call Michael Chinton. That's Prince Badru Kakungulu. This is page 68 in the corner. You see that man? That's Prince Badru Kakungulu. not Michael Chinton. But anyway, let's go on. There is one point about the failure of the Uganda state. You mentioned and didn't elaborate a lot, that the British pulled out quicker. They scrambled out of Africa. They scrambled to get into Africa, but they scrambled to get out of Africa. 1947, Sir Andrew Cohen, who became governor of Uganda, was the assistant director of the African section in the colonial office. And they drew up a plan for decolonization. And that plan envisaged the legislative council becoming a parliament, and also democratization of the district councils. And that plan was to go for another 30 or so years. However, the British government had become poor out of the war. They couldn't manage to keep the colonies. And the public opinion within the UK did not approve of colonies. The USA and the USSR, who gained out of the war, did not want colonies. So part of the reasons is that Uganda was not ready, just not ready to receive independence. We did not have a political party that had been there for more than 10 years. We did not have the politicians. We, as I will discuss with you guys on education, we did not have the educated people. But as Karugire says, I think page 174, very well put it, that Uganda was frog marched into independence. Karugire puts it perfectly well. We were not ready. So all these issues could not be debated because people did not have the capacity to do so. You imagine, Obote's highest certificate was the school certificate, the O-level. You know, that was his highest qualification. He came to Makerere, right? Now, I'm not saying education, you know, is important for people to think, but when you get education, you are exposed to more ideas, right? Edward Mutesa went to Cambridge, not to study, but to sit in. You know, he didn't study anything. So really, we didn't have seasoned politicians in Uganda to manage a complex state. And if you look at, Zeleza has a book, The Roots of African Conflict. Zeleza, you've heard of this guy? Yes. And in this book, it says that the failure of Africa is the failure to manage diversity. We failed to manage the diversity, and all the things you are saying, the clamping down on what Buganda produces, which again, Yeni Almeti discusses very well in that book. It's one of the best books on Uganda. Is that Obote and subsequent rulers failed to see that before you start redistributing wealth and making all regions equal, you must have the wealth itself. So why don't you focus on more production? It doesn't matter whether that the production takes place in Uganda or in the Western province or in the West Nile. As long as it is within Uganda, it will seep down to all provinces. And the people who are really foolish, who destroyed the West Nile, when Obote took over in 1980, they went to West Nile and destroyed everything. It was very foolish. Because you see, the wealth there would have seeped back into Uganda, seeped back everywhere. And well, there is one thing that is certain. Whenever Uganda is ruled, there will be a region that is more beneficiary than others. But if you destroy it, you are very foolish, because you see, this money will be coming back to everybody. So anyway, the lesson is for me to learn from your book is that there should be increased negotiations, increased understanding of the complex political issues of putting so many tribes and so many organizations together. There should be increased production, and we should focus on production rather than redistribution. And it is in the interest of the nation that we produced more. But thank you very much for this book. I've read it. I have a lot of problems in the areas where I put, but I think where I congratulate you and what I learned, or what sank in more now in my head, is that the 1966 crisis cannot be blamed on Ovingira, Motes, or Bote alone. It's a combination of factors. It was the result of a number of issues. I also would like to remind you that the motion to expel Uganda out of Uganda was debated, but was never passed. The Ruchiko actually never passed. They didn't have time to pass it. The two Saza chiefs were arrested before it was voted on. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and thank you, Godfrey, for this very interesting book. History has always been one of those subjects that I wish I had studied, and indeed, coming to Makerere, I'd wanted to come to study history, but then there was conflict of what subject I could choose, since the results were almost all the same. So my question really is not very academic. It's about this personality of Obote, who is often described as a very astute politician and tactful and all of that. And then in the light of some of the things you said today, I was intrigued to go back to some phrases that have been associated with him. And with all of you historians here, I want to ask you, because I have doubted that a statement like that could have come from Obote. You know what I mean? Yes, this common saying that he said a good Muganda is a dead one. I just want to understand the context, if that ever was said, how he could have said such a thing when he was married to a Muganda, which I thought was a tactful way of managing this turbulent political sphere in which he was, and it was part of his act of entering into Buganda and be accepted. That's one. Two, the issue of the Buganda question keeps coming all the time. And looking at it from the lens of historians who know also other histories of other people in the continent, I wonder whether there are other nations outside Uganda that had similar structure as Buganda, and how they navigated this issue of nation building when they got independence, and so that the thing is now perhaps no longer a question, so that we don't live constantly with the fear of, is this going to resurge? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if we could take one more question. Dr. Tunanuche, and then if we go very quickly, we'll try to take one more round.
Thank you very much, Professor Asiimwe, for this very important piece of work about the entangled relationship between Buganda and Uganda vis-a-vis sub-nationalism and nationalism. Especially in the process of nation building process. This question kept lingering within my head, and of course with various illustrations you have vividly documented. Why have states in Uganda at various stages failed to form a united state nation, or a nation state rather, despite those rigorous attempts, and of course the authority of what you have called crash mentality? Cohen crashed, Obote crashed. You were limited by the scope of the book. And of course, we have seen a fairly successful, by the way, the triumph of those whom you have tended to refer to as parochial or sub-nation opportunists, which I term in my thesis local citizenship. The local citizenship has actually triumphed more than national citizenship. Why is it the case? Despite all these attempts to really bring about Ugandanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those very good comments. Certainly, Professor Kasozi, thanks very much for pointing to other sources that can really bolster or help to further unravel some of these major issues which are discussed. And we agreed that we will meet and we make use of those good sources. Thanks, Prof. DP. This question of Obote astuteness and this statement which is attributed to him, I actually asked whether this, or the context in which this statement ever emerged. And somebody senior told me, and this reflected on Mwanga. Mwanga, and I quote him in this book, said that the Baganda, if they hate you, they attribute anything on you. So somebody told me that actually this was in relation to his wife, that the relatives of his wife were not coming, were ignoring her. But when one relative died, then they all came to her, help us do this. So Obote jokingly said, "You mean a good Muganda is a dead one?" Asking his wife, because when the man dies, now everybody becomes good to you. So we don't know whether that was the context, but politics, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. Maybe it was got out of context, and Obote didn't mean that. Now, the Buganda question, yeah, it is enduring, it's continuing, and I said that even some people think that NUP is another version of the Buganda question. And if you look at the voting and all that and the politics throughout, of course, in the 1980s, they unanimously punished Obote and voted DP. And so it's not unique. You know, Sudan just near here, Sudan is grappling with it. Even Kenya, I think the other elections, the Rift Valley and all that were near on flames. Of course, Nigeria, then Katanga. Now we have all these, the M20 what. So this is a problem that is reminiscent of the youngs. These are not nations. You see, in fact, I think African countries should be given credit because if you were to get all the Europeans different as they are and you put them under the same president, I don't think they would. So we have over 50 nations. So to box them into a nation from 1953, there are a lot certainly that have to be questioned. And others like the Bakonjo, most of the Bakonjo, over 60% are in Congo. Only a few are in Uganda. So to force a nation, that's why I call Uganda a nation in quotes, is not easy. Somalia, even for it was mainly based on clan. And the clan, to force a nation, these are artificial nations and they are slowly evolving. The national maybe institutions are slowly merging. That's why we need delicate political calculation, understanding, rather than crashing. If you bring them together into a district, you remember a man who ate a rat. So we must be alone. And because it's a question of positionality, what will be your position in this supra dispensation? You know, the very first district was Chisoro. The Bafumbira could not easily fit with the Bachiga. So this issue of diversity, as the Prof says, we've had a problem of managing it because of rushing to crush, rushing to crush or deceive, like Obote did, would wink and bring them and then you tame. And I think that's not healthy because people's agency continues. I think now the strategy NRM is using is to give districts, give a district and cultural leaders and all that. But it means a lot. It means access to resources. It means employment. It means a lot. So each group must position itself in this new dispensation. This is unavoidable. And this is where maybe Nyerere is credited for trying his best. But how I wish it could be handled in a more sophisticated way than quick fix strategies. Yeah, I think so.
Thank you. So we can, I think we'll take one more round of questions if that's all right. And then, Moses, and we also have questions online from Christopher.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thanks very much, Prof. All along I've been reading about Buganda nationalism, but in form of Kabaka crisis. Right away from my primary level, teacher comes, tells you Kabaka crisis, yet in actual sense is telling you about Buganda nationalism. Thanks very much. However, on your suggestion concerning about reconciliation and crashing, I have a concern. Where will you see Buganda by this time if trials have been made that is crushed but is still resistant? Secondly, a lot of argument have been talked about Obote crushing Buganda nationalism. But when you read the book of Karugire, somewhere he says that as an incident where a child and another man was killed at Nankulari, Obote sent Idi Amin and other people to come and investigate. But as the incident went further, Amin moved ahead and attacked the palace. In your view, should we really blame Obote for attacking Mengo, or the blame must be put on Idi Amin's dada personality, Rush Mengo? Lastly, I would like to have more enlightenment about the 1964 referendum in causing the third phase of crushing the Buganda nationalists. Because if we see the current situation, things concerning land, where people are evicted from their land, particularly in Buganda, all are coming far away from 1964 referendum that gave out what belonged to another part, which was a calculated move by our colonialists into another part. Thank you very much.
Yes, yes, Isaac, and then Christopher. Yeah.
Thanks, Prof. I listened to you. I've not read the book, I must confess, but I listened to you, and I think I was having this debate on Twitter about this seminar, and I had messages saying, why do we have sub-nationalism before the idea of nationalism? And I'm aware of how was Uganda, and I think you've said this before, how was Uganda, we always pretend, I don't know if we pretend, or we actually know, we pretend to be blind to the reality that we were forced to become a nation. And whatever that means, I'm also careful about it. because I'm always aware of the Ganda nation. I'm aware of the Toro nation. I'm aware of all these nations. And then someone comes up and says all these are sub-nations within a huge nation. And for me, that brings us back to the violence meted upon us by colonialists in trying to make us who we are. And somehow we've taken it as okay. I'm aware of how our history is a history of conquest, whether it's from many places of this country and so much more. What I liked about this is how you center Buganda and the question of Buganda. But I'm also aware of Nsibambi's work on the northern question, which unfortunately is still strong in this country, and the Karamoja question, and whether Karamoja really belongs to Uganda. And one of the things I like with Nsibambi's argument is when he questions the notion of pacification of the North, and why we should keep talking about pacification of the North, and why we should create alternative solutions for Karamoja. And then we come and say this is Uganda, and everyone seems to be having their own programs for them. So I'm thinking about this and asking, where then do we stand as a nation? I know that my doctoral supervisor is here, and this argument I've made that I don't understand this thing we call Uganda. And I made that argument because for me, the notion of saying, talking about the Ganda or talking about people from any part of this country is tribalism, which has its own contamination with it, is for me problematic. And I think it's important that even as we think about different ethnicities, and again, I'm careful not to use the word tribe, different ethnicities, we want to probably say there is a lot more about us having to think through this, again, thing we call Uganda, and ask ourselves whether this is what we want, and if we really want to work with other nations within our country. But also, you know, like he says, the Ganda question is something we are not about to resolve in this country. And I think because, since Sibambi says it openly, because Buganda is in the center of Uganda, it is the seat of government. And that already creates problems for any sitting government. And I think that is important for us, even as we think about this notion of sub-nations and nationalisms and different nationalisms that exist, and where our allegiances then come up in this thing, again, that we call Uganda. And I mean, these are things that come to mind every time questions on nationalism in this country come up, because I don't think we're about to get there. I hate to be pessimistic, but I think we are not yet about to get there. Thank you.
And maybe, so if Christopher can come now, maybe just to add a question from William that partly is tangentially related to what, you know, what's been the conversation that's been happening here. I'll just read this. William asks if, what about the idea of nationhood seems to uniformly refer to states that existed as nations, but before colonialism, but would you also refer to each of the acephalous states of Busoga, Lango, etc., as nations in their own contexts, even when they were arbitrarily amalgamated as ethnic districts at the onset of colonial rule? Would they really merit the identity of nations as well? That's the question here. He also asks a question which I don't know, maybe Professor Kasozi would know the answer to, about a group called the is it Buganda Mirembe movement from 1949, which I've also just seen referred to in the archives, but Williams also found it in the archives, and I here in National Archives, he said in the C series archival records, and wondering if we know anything about them. And yes, now Christopher.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof, for this wonderful work. Actually, from what you've shared, as well as what your book is talking about, especially the nations, what I really called the pre-colonial contact nations. I would like to hear what your comment would be about issue of the Basongora. We understand today the Basongora are questioning their status. Oh my God. Their status. And I don't know if you'd still call that a nation today. As well as the Vanilla question, we understand that we had some kind of back. I'm sorry about that. My question was about Prof's comment about the issue of the Basongora, because today we understand that these people have also documented themselves and they are questioning their status in terms of kingship, and as an established institution in Uganda, and as well the issue of the Banyara. We understand what actually happened, especially when the king was planning to go and visit that county, and we know what happened. And I understand that they have established even themselves in terms of language or something like that. I'm not so much conversant with that, but I would like to hear what the comment would be about these two groups in terms of the nations you're talking about in your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so, yeah, I think if you can, that will probably have to be our last round. Maybe just, I forgot, I was going to add one thing as well to, first to just say that I see a difference in the orientation of the early 60s UPC left and the commanding heights kind of turned to the left of the late 60s. But then also just to support what you've argued, there is in the archives a reference about from Singapore. There was a working group between I forget which ministry and the British, which were coming up with a citizenship deal, and Obote instructed them that, yes, let's sign the deal from Singapore, but I'll do it when I get back. And interestingly there, the British said, okay, but they pulled away in Singapore. And maybe there are diplomatic historians or conspiracy theorists who could inform us about that, but it's just to support this idea that there was a deal was imminent before the coup and then was interrupted by Amin. So
thanks very much for these very interesting questions. When I was analyzing what was taking place, I felt that we lacked one institution, and this is the Senate. I thought of Senate. In some countries have a higher, like even in Britain, a higher house and a lower house. I thought that what was lacking was that institution that could give guidance to the lower institutions like executive and parliament. And some of those countries have the Senate up, I think even the United States. I saw Obote and Mutesa really being slaves of their own immediate group that was not taking advice easily from a higher group, and therefore they were like moving at a trajectory that was bound to collide. So in that sense, going to the question of whether they were not justified to crush Buganda, otherwise where would it be? So on reflection, I say, because like Buganda declared independence, but they did not follow it up. And there was a very big group of progressive Buganda, including UPCs, very many. So if there had been a higher house, would it not have reigned over those extreme positions and like navigated the middle class rather than leave Obote with the Nechons and Felix Onama and Mutesa with the neo-traditionalists who had even shrunk? Because the fact that they already negotiated where they were deceived, which means negotiation could have been possible. That's why I think the leadership needs to be up to the task, because these were artificial nations. And you remember, Uganda started emerging as a nation in 1953. Before, it was under indirect rule. Each unit, each ethnic group, each polity was ruling itself. In addition to being divide and rule. So when you immediately now say you are putting up a nation and you rush through it, you are certainly bound to meet mistakes. As Professor said, that actually we still had about 30 years to be independent. So it was costly. Even to Obote, by the way, it was very costly to him. Not only losing the 1980 elections, but he was, I understand he was not even, his body was not allowed to pass here. I don't know where it passed. But it was costly for UPC. Than if they had, understand they were young, Obote was young, and these were very complex, and the British were like rushing and say, you will solve the others. And so what would he have done? So there was lack of that supra tier up. Well, I don't know, they would have been elected to really reign over the excesses and extremism and all that. There were opportunities. You could see that here, if there was this intervention, maybe this would cool down and all that. Yes, that's why I advocate for this statecraft that, as Professor Kasozo said, I think we lacked leaders of experience at that time. They were not experienced. They were not experienced. So if you have a hammer, everything it sees it as a nail to hit. So that was the problem. Unfortunately, even now you have such methods of dealing with these, because as the doctor there points out, these sub-nationalisms. I mean, people are entitled to have their identity. Is it bad to be in your identity? Actually, people, that is your first identity. Maybe if Buganda's federal system had not been corrupted, we would be together in a federal, like where we have diversity and we come together. But forcing us, we can't run away from our identities. Because when we go to the center, you see, even now it's still very, very important for each community to have a minister. Actually, at one time, Museveni tried to solve it by having about 100 ministers, each ethnic group. Because, I mean, this is your launching pad to this new center. How are resources divided there? How about jobs? Whom do you know? So we can't be a nation like Japan, where everybody is Japanese. So those secondary issues don't emerge. So one's culture, one's identity, one's is first and foremost important. And then you go on the negotiation table, and it's a give and take. And yeah, your interests are there. Otherwise, you are subsumed. So when I had that, it is a man eating a rat in order to assert that we have to go away from these chapadolas. I mean, at the district level there. By the way, even in religious institutions, it came up. I talk of how the first archbishop was rejected and he had to go to Nakasero, all those. So it's human nature to maximize your interests, and that identity in most cases forms the fulcrum on which to demand. This sub-nationalism, as I said, they were enhanced by indirect rule, and others were banded together into districts. And this was the case with the Bugisu. The Bugisu were put with, I think, the Sabino what. And the issue even of a town, the district town, became an issue. Each was putting his direction until the Bugisu insisted that they will not enter independence in Uganda if that's not resolved. So there is that tendency in these artificially crafted states for the political expedience of colonialism or what. And I think it's work in progress. There are some emerging togetherness that is coming up, but this was the problem. And as a nation, it's work in progress, and we have to take it as work in progress. Some may not feel that they are part of this nation because of negligence, because of, so some are still looking at their safety in their position as having to be anchored on their social political power base. So do we have a national army? Do we have national parties? Do we have, those are still very sensitive issues to show that we've not yet really evolved, and it is still work in progress. What about the idea of nationhood? Are there others also nations? A nation is, I take nationality as your identity. You see, the lower form is tribe. And that's derogatory. Tribe means a community. Some people use it loosely, but it's unfortunate. A community that is at primitive stage. So higher communities are nationalities. Okay, so indeed, most of these communities in Uganda had attained their own civilization, had their own logics, had their own organizations. unfortunately, like the Basoga, they tried to copy Buganda because otherwise they had principalities, these decentralized principalities. But then you find that because the question of presidency was tagged to traditional leader, so they tried to perfect their feudal system. But otherwise they had their principalities, and those had their own logics. And that's why even now it is still problematic to get a Chabazinga with, because I mean, these had their own logics. The Bachiga tried, as I point out, to fabricate a retouched one on the like the Buganda model. The Bakonjo were also decentralized. Now they try to fabricate a kingdom because of this. So I think these were nationalities, good in their own right, with their own logics. They were not tribes that they were hunting and gathering and all that. They had their own systems. So that's why I call them nationalities. Yes. And the Basongora question, yes, when the Bakonjo fabricated a kingdom, and it's still a question, I think Chiyonga is still a very, so they also started now suppressing or trying to subjugate. And here, this is where you talk of these other sub-nationalisms, small nationalism. I think the people have their right to their identity. And maybe like the Bakochi had an understanding with Uganda through negotiation, and they had their own way, agreed on how they would cooperate. But if it is imposition, like in Kayunga or where, then that also shows that you are not respecting. Now, traditionally, like Manja Kaji said, that the states used to grow through annexation, expansion, annexation. So you were saying if there is, if they gave us those territories of Nakasongora, those therefore are ours. But then you can see what happened in the lost counties. You see? So the Bamba also came up and said, no, 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 you cannot come here and assert that you are above us, the Basongora. So all these identities, I think, are good. We can't lose our identity. But how they fit in the matrix is the issue. And I think we need to have really very astute leadership to bring us all together and feel that, yes, now we are a nation, rather than being coerced in, because coercion is not sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, and thank you to everyone who's joined us for this seminar. We really appreciate learning about the book and the project, and I hope that people will get a chance to read it in full. So just once again, I'd like to thank Professor Asiimwe very much for the presentation and discussion today. Just a note that we'll please join us just in 2 days on Friday for another seminar with Professor Kasozi. And if you need a hard copy of the paper, we have them right here as well. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing everyone on Friday. Yeah, thank you.